90 Miles from Needles, the Desert Protection Podcast, is made possible by listeners just like you. If you want to help us out, you can go to 90milesfromneedles.com/donate or text NEEDLES to 53555.
Think the deserts are barren wastelands? Think again. It's time for 90 Miles from Needles, the Desert Protection Podcast.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome to 90 Miles from Needles, the Desert Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Clarke, and we are recording this on November 6th, Thursday, which means that as I record this, we are in day 37 of the ongoing shutdown of the federal government. This has become officially the longest shutdown in U.S. history, and that's relevant to this episode because we are going to be speaking with a currently furloughed federal employee who is also a graduate student in conservation biology at UC Riverside, Nick Graver. And the shutdown and the ongoing reductions in force by the federal government as they gut federal agencies protecting people and the environment might also make his research potentially useless. I think you're going to find it an interesting conversation. And we're very happy to have Nick join us and talk a little bit about how the shutdown and ongoing federal purges are affecting his work. And we'll get to that really quickly. But I wanted to mention that since our episode last week, we have gotten 0 new donors. In fact, we've only gotten 2 new donors since the beginning of October, which is a little bit concerning. If you value the work that we do here at 90 Miles from Needles and the Desert Advocacy Media Network, now is a particularly important moment to lend a hand. Over the past month, we've just welcomed those 2 new donors, and we are deeply grateful for them and for all of you who already support the show. But it's also a reminder of how much our work depends on a broader circle of people that care about the desert as much as we do, and as much as I am guessing you do. Every episode here takes time, research, logistics, tracking people down, scheduling interviews, and it also takes the kind of field experience between my own decades in journalism and desert stuff and the expertise of our board of directors that lets us tell the desert's stories with depth and honesty and appropriate context. And some episodes take travel as well, and that runs up the bills. Listener support is what makes us able to do that. And when you donate, you are not just keeping this podcast going. You're helping us amplify campaigns to defend fragile landscapes. You're helping us promote desert voices and keep this far-flung community of desert defenders strong. So if you've thought about pitching in but haven't yet, this is a great time to do it. Even a few dollars a month truly makes a difference. And you can go to 90milesfromneedles.com/donate to do that. Relatedly, you may well be familiar with the concept of Giving Tuesday, which is a new holiday started in 2012 or thereabouts, in which people give money to good causes and do other non-monetary forms of helping, whether that's volunteering at a food bank or whatever. It's the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, celebrated every year. Last year, we had a really disappointing Giving Tuesday. We are grateful for everyone who donated, but it came in well short of what we had imagined might come in. And that was due to the fact that it's really, really crowded on Giving Tuesday. If you're looking to give $5 or $20 or $100 to a worthy enviro organization, and you want to do it on Giving Tuesday, it's really hard to pick one because there are hundreds of environmental groups asking for your money on Giving Tuesday. And so we thought, given our kind of lackluster results last year, how can we approach Giving Tuesday? If we're just asking for money, we're going to be up against some very stiff competition. You know, some organizations that have multiple full-time staff people working just on fundraising and social media. We have 0 full-time staff here. And so we get outcompeted, and fair enough. We like a lot of these organizations that are outrunning us on Giving Tuesday, and we want to be supportive and collegial. And so what we decided last year is that on this Giving Tuesday, this year, sure, we'll take some money if you want to give it, We have no problem with that. But what we're going to be using Giving Tuesday for is amplifying the campaigns of other groups. I mean, our friends at the Sierra Club and the Nature Conservancy and Center for Biological Diversity have it covered. They got really good people working for them, encouraging you to donate on Giving Tuesday. But it's the smaller groups, the groups that are worried about one particular development or a tributary of an ephemeral river that they live along or one neighborhood in a desert city. Those are the groups that could really use our help. And so what we're going to do on this Giving Tuesday, Tuesday after Thanksgiving, is raising up the appeals of smaller grassroots groups that we think could use our help and whose work we appreciate. And all this is to say that if you know of one of these groups that deserves more attention, or if you're part of one of these groups, get in touch with us. Let's see if we can work together this month. You can reach me at chris@90milesfromneedles.com. That's 90, the numeral 90. You can also find us on Facebook and on Instagram. Just search for 90 Miles from Needles and you'll find us. Let's see if we can work together this Giving Tuesday. And with that, let's get to our talk with Nick Graver, conservation biologist and general desert guy, about how the shutdown and federal cutbacks in general are affecting not only his work, but conservation of desert plants in general.
Graver. I work at Joshua Tree National Park. That is not the capacity that I am representing today. I don't speak for the U.S. government today. That is just a biographical detail. I am also a graduate student, a PhD student at University of California, Riverside. I'm studying conservation biology, particularly population modeling, how to save the Joshua trees. And I live in 29 Palms, California. And I dedicate all of my work to protecting biodiversity in the desert, in particular the Mojave, and also this transition across the Mojave-Colorado border.
Conservation biology is a huge field and there's a lot of subdisciplines in it. Would you call yourself a botanist or is it broader than that?
I tend to prefer plant ecologist. My focus is more on the science of ecology, particularly using plants as a study system, more so than it is plant taxonomy, for instance.
Right.
I am more interested in how these organisms exist in their environment than I am in classifying them into the right category, or a lot of the work that looks at evolutionary history of those plants. That's great, and I love it, and I love reading about it. That's not my research.
So you're not like soaking Joshua tree seeds in colchicine to get tetraploid Joshua trees or anything like that. It's more a study of the interrelationships between the trees and everything else.
Yeah, I'd love to read that research.
Yeah, me too. That would be fascinating. Just sort of the 30,000 foot view, what are things like in the desert right now?
We've known for 15 or 20 years now that Joshua trees in particular were threatened by climate change. We've known for a long time that climate change was going to influence the desert and was going to impact a lot of populations. We're now seeing it in real time. We're able to measure declining rates of reproduction in lower elevations on a lot of species. The thing that has really changed over the last few years has been the wildfire situation. We had wildfires in the desert in the past. Historically, lightning struck a Joshua tree, a pinyon pine, burned some amount of area, and then burned out. Nowadays, we're seeing widespread fire of the kind that we don't think is natural in the desert, that we don't think has a historical precedent. And it's killing millions of Joshua trees in a single wildfire.
Right.
And that sort of like scale of destruction is really quite terrifying. Another thing that has changed in the last 5 years is that we're seeing a lot more human-caused wildfire. So one of the things, some of the basics of how we get fire where it shouldn't be is called the grass fire cycle. So we have invasive grasses introduced by humans into this environment. They fill in the spaces between the shrubs and they make fires able to spread more quickly. We see a ton of evidence for that in Joshua Tree National Park. And fires spread more rapidly because of that. That then creates a cycle that creates more fire in the environment. And then those invasive grasses also tend to be really good at acquiring nutrients after fire and like growing in a post-burn landscape. They tend to be the best competitors. And you see over time conversion of those landscapes. So you have an environment that is more grassy and has less of your native plants in it, less of your shrubs and creosote bush and your Joshua trees and your pinyon pine and your juniper in particular. And so that cycle exists once we introduce invasive grasses the first time. But the reality is that humans are engaging a lot more in the desert. Mm-hmm. They're coming out into the desert a lot more. There's a much higher human population in the desert than there ever has been before. And we're coming out with vehicles, we're coming out with campfires, we're coming out with a whole bunch of sources of ignition. And those sources of ignition are also a critical component of what's going on. Joshua Tree National Park, 1970 to 2010 or so, had routine small fires, a couple large fires, a couple up to 20,000 acres, but a lot of fires that were happening, mostly lightning caused, mostly spread by invasive grasses. So still human caused fire. But what we've seen in the last 5 years is every single fire we've had that's been of any size, any notable size, has been human caused. So we're now in this landscape where we have 3 million visitors instead of 800,000, 900,000, a million each year. And so there's just way more people, 3 times as many people as there used to be out on the landscape. And there's a lot more causes of fire. So there's some research out that's posited a change from what we call the grass fire cycle to the human grass fire cycle. And that's we're introducing new invasive species all the time. We're introducing ignition all the time. And so we are actively engaged in causing this problem.
Right.
And it's not just something that we've triggered a long time ago and nature is figuring itself out. It's that we are continually contributing to the problem.
And we have done some episodes in the past on Joshua trees and what they're facing in the 21st century. And we'll put a link in the show notes to those episodes. But as of last year, the Western Joshua tree, at least, is protected in the state of California. And so everything is okay now, right?
So I think that it's important to recognize that most Joshua trees live on federal land. And so what the state of California can do mostly influences state and private lands. And I think generally it's good that we're taking action to protect Joshua trees. And there's a lot of good stuff that can come of those protections. Right. But as I said, in order to protect a species like this that exists across a lot of land, exists across 4 U.S. states, and a species that is critically important to the ecosystem across 4 U.S. states and is being threatened across 4 U.S. states, we need to have diverse partnerships. We need to have the federal government working with the states. We need to have the states and the federal government working with researchers that are able to do that work. We need to have every one of those actors consulting with tribes, following indigenous leadership on how to conserve species that are critically important to their culture and their history and their presence on the landscape, and that was a food source for them, and all those things that makes that species so important. I think we do a pretty good job recognizing the importance of Joshua trees. There's statements from U.S. senators about how important Joshua trees are. There's news articles about Joshua trees being cut down. It's something that we recognize as a culture is important to us. We have a national park named after Joshua trees. Mm-hmm. We've recognized, maybe not perfectly so, but we recognize that this is a really important species, and we need to be taking large-scale collective action with the public to be conserving these species. And instead, state of California and federal government don't get along very well these days.
Right.
The federal government and research universities don't get along very well these days. Obviously, all those things are composed of human beings on the ground who care about these things, and people are trying to make those relationships still work in what ways they can. But when you have a coordinated attack from every angle from the government, where the administration has planned out how they're going to destroy science and destroy the institutions of research and conservation in this nation, And nobody in those institutions was prepared for that coordinated attack. I mean, not nobody. People were thinking about it, but they didn't have a planned response in the way that the administration came in with a set of agenda items and fired them all off really rapidly and without much of a care as to what the negative impacts were, even when those impacts, their priorities and their goals.
Yeah, I think even the pessimists among us, myself included, were caught by surprise by just how vicious the attack has been on the sciences and on a lot of other basic good things that we expect from the government. So,
yeah, I think I was less shocked by the things that they tried to do and more shocked by the things that everyone let them get away with.
yeah.
You know, the Supreme Court was going to just rubber stamp everything without reviewing cases and just magically declare that nobody has standing for anything anymore. We didn't expect that nationwide injunctions were going to be blocked and every individual person who was harmed by a case was supposed to sue individually. That level of cooperation was unexpected. We expected that illegal actions would still be just declared illegal and reversed, as opposed to, we've been going through with the government shutdown, been monitoring closely court cases on how many park employees are they allowed to fire right now, and National Park Service employees. That case has been a lot of back and forth about who exactly this applies to. So the context there is that the government announced that it was going to fire as many employees as they could possibly get away with due to the government shutdown, which has never happened before. It's not something that occurs in government shutdowns.
Mm-hmm.
You furlough employees, you put them on non-pay status, but you don't just fire them. And the administration has advanced this like completely nonsense legal theory that this allows them to just fire everybody they want to, and that Congress has no mandates, that no laws exist, basically. The argument is that because Congress hasn't funded the government, that there is no mandate for any of the government's functions to exist anymore. And so the administration declares that they have absolute power to just eliminate any programs they don't like. And so that is obviously a nonsense legal theory, and it's obviously very illegal, and the courts have already ruled as such. They've already said, yes, this is illegal. But because we don't have the same kind of blanket rulings we used to have from courts, it means that there's a whole ton of back and forth about who does this court case actually apply to. So the unions have sued, federal unions have sued to block firings of all of their members and anyone who is in a same program as those members. But then there's a ton of back and forth about exactly which unions does this apply to, exactly which agencies does this apply to. People who, like me, I work at a park that doesn't have a union right now. There's no protections for people who work at Joshua Tree National Park because it doesn't have a union yet. And that puts us in a very vulnerable position, not because it's not illegal, because the court's already ruled that it's illegal, but because that court ruling that says it's illegal doesn't apply to a particular employee at Joshua Tree National Park unless that employee individually hires a lawyer and sues. And so that's what I didn't expect coming into this year, was that all of these individual actions were going to have to be sued by every single individual. Every single American that is harmed by lacking food stamps is now supposed to sue on behalf of getting food stamps.
Yeah, just dip into the trust fund that they haven't been touching to buy food.
Yeah, and so it's like, we're all working class people and middle class people that don't have our own lawyers. And this expectation that everyone has a lawyer to sue, or that I would be declared standing when I'm upset about something in the conservation world. In the past, there's conservation groups that can sue over that, and they are doing that, and that is very important work. But it's been a lot harder for anyone to have any standing in court under this new weird theory of legality that we're in, where if you can't find somebody who is directly harmed by the illegal action, then the action is legal after all.
Yeah. So what does this look like for your work? I mean, you've touched on it, even though we're not talking about you as a Park Service employee, you've touched on the furlough aspect of things, but how has this affected the work that you're doing as a grad student?
The work that I do, the purpose of my research is to design population models for how best to conserve land, what land management strategies work best to protect species. That's the work of our lab. Ellen Regan's lab at UC Riverside. And that lab is all about population modeling for conservation purposes. So how can a land manager make the best decisions to conserve a species?
Right.
For me in particular, that research is going to be focused on Joshua trees. It's going to be focused on how can land managers, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the National Park Service, the BLM, anybody that manages Joshua trees, how can they make the best decisions to save the Joshua trees and to save the species that depend on those Joshua trees? But particularly looking at the populations of Joshua trees and what happens. You know, we know we're losing a bunch of suitable habitat for Joshua trees, but we don't know what exactly that means for those populations. We don't know whether they're losing their ability to reproduce, whether those young trees are dying at a young age, or whether they're all dying in wildfire, or what it is that is actually going to mechanically affect the populations of Joshua trees on the landscape. But all of that, making good recommendations, is sort of pointless if there's nobody there to receive those recommendations. If there is not a group of people that is implementing those actions, right? Mm-hmm. And so we can consult with tribes about the best way to protect a species, and we can design all these models about the best way to protect a species. But if nobody is paid to go do the work of whatever those actions are, fighting fire in the right places, restoring the right places, if it is managed relocation or moving Joshua trees to new locations, whatever those solutions are that we come up with, they're the best, most effective, scientifically supported solutions to save a population, to save in the Mojave Desert ecosystem. If there's nobody there to hear those ideas, right, and implement those changes, then it's all pointless. And so I worry about that with my research of like, how can I recommend to the vegetation branch manager of Joshua Tree National Park how to save the Joshua trees if that vegetation branch manager is an empty chair? So that person retired in December. That was supposed to be a job that was supposed to get filled, and it's been blocked by this hiring freeze. And I don't know if the administration ever has any intention of replacing the person who makes the decision to save the Joshua trees. And so as a researcher, I'm really trying to evaluate, like, what's the effectiveness of this work going forward? I think it's going to be effective. I think it's going to be even more important that we know how to make the maximum impact for the fewest dollars. But that's maybe a different question than how to save the species. It's like, how do we save a few thousand individuals if that's all we have funding to do? So it's really hard to envision that future of like, this is what this looks like, because the past vision of that future was that we all come together, we build up coordinated resources between agencies, and we work together on a big plan to save the species. And that big plan is still out there, and I think it can still happen, but we have to fight harder for it. One of the goals of my research is actually to try and reconstruct that history of the Joshua trees and how fast they grow, how frequently they flower, what their life history is actually like. Because we're doing this research on short time scales, on a matter of a few years. The longest standing Joshua tree published research is maybe 2 decades, but there's very little information on what the long-term growth rate of the trees is. There's no information on how many flower stalks they produce over the course of their life or anything like that. And so one of my chapters in my dissertation, hopefully, will be retracing life history, going back in time. That branching pattern that Joshua trees are famous for, especially in Western Joshua trees, is a record of the life history of the tree. So that first height to first branch, that growth rate to where it first branches, or that length of trunk, is how long that tree lived for as a juvenile before it branched for the first time. They flower, and that flower occupies the apical meristem that allows the tree to grow more. And so it can't keep growing in that one direction. It has to branch every time it flowers. And Western Joshua trees pretty much only branch when they flower. Eastern Joshua trees, they branch whenever they want to, and it makes it more complicated and more difficult. But if you're looking at a Western Joshua tree, every crook in the branches, every direction change in that branch is a record of a flowering instance of the tree. And you can actually just go and count how many flower stalks are on that tree or were on that tree at some point. And you can figure out what that reproductive history of that tree was, how much it's produced flower stalks. You can't tell how many fruits it's produced, but you can tell how many flower stalks it's produced over the course of its life. And then I'm doing additionally radiocarbon dating on some of those old flower stalks to figure out when exactly that flower stalk occurred, and then to be able to calculate from there how many flower stalks it's producing over time, how fast it's growing over time. Those things, we're just on the verge of developing some tools and some strategies for figuring out what that life history of the tree is, to go back in time to be able to tell, like, the stuff that we can tell really easily off of an oak tree, because it has tree rings, has growth rings. You can just take a core and you can figure out a whole bunch of information about that tree. There's ways to do it for Joshua trees. It's just a little bit more work.
Yeah.
And that's a focus of what I'm trying to do with my research.
Are you looking at rephotography and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think there's rephotography. I think one function of what I am trying to do, and if anybody has ideas for where to get old photos of Joshua trees flowering, where we know the location and the date that photo was taken, it would be fantastic to be able to go back to some of those old flower stalks and see if we can find a piece of that flower stalk and actually validate those methods as radiocarbon methods. They're well-tested methods, but they always need some validation if you can get it. I'm trying to look for old photos of trees in flower from decades ago and be able to go back to those and find out what we can find out about those trees.
Have you looked at the postcards that the photographer Burton Fraser put out in the 20s and 30s?
I haven't gone that far back. So a lot of it, part of it is needing a location and all that stuff. The 20s and 30s, I think, so the radiocarbon methods I'm using work for until about 1950. It's called bomb radiocarbon. It relies on another aspect of human existence, which is that we blew up a bunch of nukes in the 50s, especially, and 60s.
And possibly the 2030s.
And possibly the 2030s. So that there's a record in the atmosphere of your carbon-14 ratio as a result of all that nuclear testing, and it causes a spike. And so normal carbon-14 dating uses the decay of carbon-14 over centuries. And instead, we've got this massive spike in the curve just in the last 100 years or so. Mm-hmm. And so that enables a sort of modern bomb radiocarbon dating that you can look at the last 70 years. And there's a little bit of a gray period older than that, which kind of makes it a little complicated to look at. Anything from 1750 to 1950 is a kind of a gray period and difficult to do. But the interesting thing about that is that those radiocarbon methods, the carbon-14 in the atmosphere has declined so much that we are now looking at not being able to do those methods after about the year 2030, that it's going to be just back to background levels of those concentrations, which bizarrely means that unless we throw off a bunch more nukes in the next decade or so, then we won't be able to use those methods for stuff going forward. We can only look at that period of 1950 to 2030 or so.
Right.
So maybe there'll be something good if we do fall into thermonuclear war.
I was looking through, there was in 2010, 09 and 2010, might still be there, an archive of Fraser's postcards. He'd just go out and take photos of the desert Southwest and then print them up, and he'd take them to Fred Harvey stores and things like that. So he's got a fan base. And I was looking at one particular postcard that his notes said Centennial Flat, 1920. Hey, Future Chris here. Turns out I was wrong. I went and found the photo, and it actually was taken in 1926. And the caption that Burton Fraser put on it read Coso Range rather than Centennial Flat. You can check our show notes for a copy of that image. And there was a tree that was sort of in the background of a larger tree. The tree that was in the background looked strangely sort of deja vu-ish. And just on a hunch, I went and I got a copy of an image of the U2 album. And it was that same big sprawling tree, except 60 years younger. And it was such an awesome thing just to find. The skyline matched, the hills in the background. The big Joshua tree that was in front of the smaller one was long gone. But you could see where the tree had split in 1920, and it had in 1980 when, Bono was standing out in front of it, there were really robust trunks coming out of that same spot. I'll have to dig up the Bird and Fraser one and send it along.
I wonder if we measured the height of first branch on that tree and the height of some of those people that we know how tall they were and calculated out the growth rate of the tree from Bird and Fraser's photograph, if we could actually get any usable information out of all that, because it might actually be possible with just a little bit of proportions.
Yeah, they're both really good photographs. Anton Corbin had more advanced equipment than Burton did, but I actually went to that tree. For a long time, it was a very closely guarded secret where the tree was. Just the U2 superfans would share it and text messages and things like that. And I finally found a website that had better directions for how to get there, and went, and Palmer had said, send me a sample of the tree and we'll see if we can get any DNA out of it. It had been dead for 10 years at that point, maybe. And I did, and he didn't get anything useful out of it, but it was just a fascinating little side quest for my trip into the desert at that point.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I can get a radiocarbon date off of it.
It's still there.
Shouldn't be a problem.
Have you been out that way?
I have not been to the tree. I've been all over where the Joshua trees are, but I have not been to that particular, pilgrimage. Will maybe happen this next few years as I go out to more and more sites to collect more and more dead pieces of Joshua trees.
It's a good place to go on your way to Conglomerate Mesa, places like that. It's maybe a 3-minute walk off of pavement. And when you get there because there's a plaque that's been set into the ground with sort of a bas-relief copper plate that had an image of the tree, and then the caption, "Have you found what you're looking for?" Which little U2 reference there.
Yeah.
But it's a cool spot. And, a lot of mortality there for the older trees, not a lot of recruitment. It's different up on Conglomerate Mesa. There's a bunch of recruitment up there, which is nice.
That's cool. Yeah. It's always interesting to see where the trees, where they're reproducing. It's not everywhere. It is some places and not other places. And because they're biological creatures and they don't ascribe to rules or listen to what's being said, you don't always see the patterns you expect or the patterns that the data presents. Oftentimes, you need a lot of data aggregated in ecology to be able to see that trend, because there's a whole bunch of stuff going on at a bunch of different places that have their own individual conditions and trees that have their own individual adaptation to the space. So that's the challenge of all this. You got to go a lot of places and see a lot of things to make it really make sense.
Yeah, it seems like you have a little bit of lead time that you can use up just because they're species that have a 200-year lifespan in good conditions, assuming that they don't burn down.
I'm not so sure. I like to think that Joshua trees, they're not as threatened as some of the most vulnerable species in the Mojave. They are quite threatened, but we have seen, in the last 6 years, we've seen millions of Joshua trees die due to wildfire. And we don't really have a lot of time to make a better wildfire management strategy 4 years from now, because what if we lose another 5 million Joshua trees in the next 4 years? We actually have to make some swift changes to our policy and how we take care of this desert. I think along with that, there is an inherent problem with Joshua trees, and it's one of the things that makes them great and makes them able to last for a long time, is they have these really long generation times. But it also is a handicap for anyone that is trying to do any management actions to save a species. So the Joshua trees that we plant this year or last year or next year out in these restoration areas, they're probably not going to come to seed to reproduce themselves for 50 to 70 years. And so we kind of get one generation with climate change. The trees that we plant in 2025, by the time that those trees grow to adulthood, it will already be 2070, and the climate will have already changed. And so a lot of restoration strategies depend on, well, we're small people on a huge landscape. We're looking at the Arc Fire was 94,000 acres or something like that. We can't plant 94,000 acres of plants on the landscape. We have to rely on this idea of multiple generations, that the trees regenerate themselves. We plant some, and then those come to fruit, and then those spread those seeds around, and then those seeds grow up to adulthood, and those seeds come around. And that's sort of like multiple generations of work.
Right.
When we're talking about a restoration plan for Joshua trees, we need to be talking about a 200-year time scale because of that, because that's only 3 generations of trees. And that's only if it goes well, right? 3 or 4 generations. So these trees exist on this this time interval that is so much longer than us and is also so much shorter than climate change, that I think that we are way behind the curve in a lot of senses of like, if we wanted to restore Joshua trees, we needed to start doing it a long time ago.
Yeah.
And some of the other important species, such as saguaro cactus, people started being concerned about saguaro cactus almost 100 years ago, maybe 80 years ago. Mm-hmm. There's research plots for saguaro that have been going for 80 years. That's not the case for Joshua trees. We don't have that kind of like time scale. We don't have that quite that same amount of like push that has been going for a long time. It's kind of a new thing to be worried about the Joshua trees. Mm-hmm. We had Joshua Tree National Park. We were worried about the national monument was created because Minerva Hoyt was worried about the destruction of all desert plants. And
right.
Joshua trees happened to be a good poster child for that. So they, instead of calling it Desert Plants National Monument, they called it Joshua Tree National Monument because that would get people excited about conserving these plants. It's like thinking about a specific one that we all care about a lot. But this idea that it's being threatened is kind of new. That's kind of like 20 years old.
Don't go away. We'll be right back.
We'll be back to our conversation with Nick Graver in just a moment. But I honestly couldn't think of a better piece of Fred Bell's nature recording to feature in this episode than this one. It's dawn breaking over the Wee Thump Joshua Tree Wilderness in Clarke County, southern Nevada. Enjoy.
You're listening to 90 Miles from Needles, the Desert Protection Podcast. You can help the desert by picking up those dang Mylar balloons.
I've been looking at Joshua trees for a while, and I remember that when I first started digging into the topic seriously, it was like 96 or 97. Mm-hmm. And I'd go over to UC and sneak into the library and try and look up scholarly papers 20 years before Google Scholar. And most of the citations of genus Yucca were about adding it to livestock food. And that was mostly like Spanish bayonets and some Mojave yuccas and things like that. There were, I think, 2 papers on Joshua tree. Joshua trees were just sort of a blank spot in the research. And then slowly with people like Uli Pelmer looking at the moths and Chris Smith doing the Joshua Tree Genome Project and then Jeremy Yoder. And now people like Jeremy Yoder and Juniper Harrower who were like, they were pretty new to the topic when I started seeing the amount of scholarly interest in the species growing. They're like the old guard now.
Yep.
And it's just been really fascinating to watch how this really accessible species is not hard to find. It's not a snow leopard. It's not a cave crustacean or anything like that. It's like right out in the open. As Brendan Cummings has said a bunch of times, you can see it from space. It's just really interesting that it was such a blank spot on the map back in the mid-90s and completely the opposite today.
Yeah, so it's funny that we talk a lot about the really fantastic relationship between the yucca moths and the yuccas and the Joshua trees and the Joshua tree moths. That was remarked on by Charles Darwin. It was observed by somebody who sent him a letter about it, but he regarded it as the most wonderful case of pollination ever published. And it probably still is today.
This is a really good excuse to talk about one of my favorite 19th century entomologists, Charles Valentine Riley, who was actually the first person to document for science the special relationship that yuccas, including Joshua trees, have with yucca moths. There is a moth species for the western Joshua tree and a different species for the eastern. And like other yuccas, both species of Joshua trees absolutely rely on these yucca moths to pollinate their flowers, which enables the trees to set fruit and produce seeds. And the moths get something in return because they lay an egg, and sometimes two, on each fruit that they pollinate. That egg hatches out into a larva, and the larva eats a certain number of the seeds, generally about a fifth. The larva then emerges from the fruit, drops to the ground, tunnels down, pupates, goes into a little cocoon, and then emerges mysteriously as an adult moth when the plant is flowering again. It's a fascinating kind of obligate mutualism, a really good example of coevolution. In fact, the canonical example of coevolution. Riley was notable for a couple other things as well. He saved the French wine industry by noticing that an American species of grape, Vitis labrusca, was resistant to phylloxera, a pathogen that was devastating tens of thousands of grapes in France. And he, with a colleague, grafted French grape on Vitis labrusca rootstock. He was lauded by the French and named a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor in 1884. He was also one of the first people to practice biological pest control. There was a scale insect that was harming the California citrus industry, which was in its very early stages. And he introduced a beetle that was a known predator of that scale, and it worked. Riley was born in September 1843 in London, moved to the U.S. when he was 17, eventually made it out to St. Louis, where he became the official state entomologist of Missouri, was a collaborator and correspondent of Charles Darwin, and a fervent espouser of Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection. And just a few days before his 52nd birthday, on 14th September 1895, while riding a bicycle near his home in Washington, D.C., he was going down a hill too fast, hit a granite paving block that was misplaced, catapulted off and hit his head, died the same day, just short of the age of 52. As someone who is both really interested in yuccas and various insects and who survived a similar accident on a bicycle about 50 years ago, I find a lot to relate to in Charles Valentine Riley.
But it took 120 years maybe before anybody realized there was more than one species of yucca moth and more than 3 species of yucca moth. And I think Ellie Palmer, I think like 20 or 30 or 40 species that research group identified of yucca moth and how closely they're tied to different lineages of yuccas. And that's sort of like, holy cow, this is a fantastic study system as a researcher. That sort of idea of like, we can actually look at coevolution and we can look at co-speciation and all those, like, you know, it's been recorded for a long time that this was a cool thing that occurred.
Yep.
But the fact that it's been a really awesome example of how coevolution works and about how species come to exist and how species come to exist because of their relationship with other species. Our understanding of science has been deepened by the existence of the Joshua tree in a really profound way. And then also our understanding of how a widespread species can still be very threatened by widespread problems. We're used to almost every other case in the in the history of California's Endangered Species Act, almost every plant species that has been listed has been like a real small area, even some species that exist on like an acre or a couple acres. And now we're talking about a species that occupies a substantial area in 4 U.S. states. And so it's like, wow, conservation needs to adapt from thinking about those individual species at individual locations. We still need to worry about those species. We still need to think about biodiversity in terms of losing individuals in certain areas. But we also need to think about landscape scale change, and our strategies need to adapt, and our management of wildfire needs to adapt to meet that need.
How has this affected funding for your work?
The reality is that my research group has a lot of diverse funding sources. So I applied for, as early career graduate students do, an NSF graduate research fellowship program last year. And I wrote a lot about how I'd like to fight climate change and incorporate indigenous knowledge in my work and all that stuff that was highly valued in the last administration. And I didn't get my NSF grant. And there was another one that my lab applied for that we didn't get. Your expectation when you apply for those grants is that you don't get them.
Right.
And so like most of the time you don't succeed at those grants. They're very, very highly competitive. And so we don't really know what sort of political intervention may or may not have caused us to not have access to those grants. It's going to be permanently unknown whether I didn't get that because my proposal wasn't competitive within the top 10% of applicants, or if it's because nobody wants to support climate change research anymore. So that's like not that big. It's an unknown. And like we're going to be dealing with that unknown for many years of like whether certain research is being politically intervened with or not. We know that there are still scientists reviewing proposals at NSF and going through their normal process that seems relatively regular to them now that the courts have required the reinstatement of a lot of those grants. We also know that they can be filtering stuff on the back end and not telling anyone. And we don't know which proposals are just rejected out of hand because they say climate change in them.
Right.
We know that the whole structure of the process has changed such that people aren't willing to put in those words like climate change and diversity and all those things into a proposal anymore because they want to find ways to let the scientists reviewing their proposal know that it's about climate change, but they don't want to let the administration have an AI decide that your proposal is no good and kick it out before it ever gets to those scientists.
Call it ecosystem response to global conditions or something like that.
Yeah. And put wildfire in the title.
Yep.
So we're sort of like wandering around in the dark a little bit in those regards. I'm not a researcher that's had a major grant canceled. Lots of people have had those things canceled or pulled out from underneath them in all sorts of illegal ways and ways that the courts have ruled are illegal. But everyone's sort of operating in this new sphere of maybe it's not even worth applying for funding, that fear of those things. And I encourage everyone that's in those cases to keep pushing, keep applying for grants, keep putting in that work to demonstrate that there's a need there.
Yeah.
And to keep trying, because a lot of the ways that this process functions with this, like, I don't want to say evil plan, but the way this evil plan functions is to make you give up hope and make you quit your job or not bother applying, because it's so much easier for them to deal with you if you're being quiet and hiding and doing whatever in your back room and doing less. But the acceptable response as a human being when crisis is happening is not to do less. We can't just go hide. That impulse is there for everyone, right? Yeah. Go hide, put your head down, and maybe that's appropriate in some places, but keep doing the work however you can. That's critically important.
Yeah, I think hiding for 1.5 days out of every 7, that could work. Self-care is important.
It is. This sort of chaotic situation that we're in is intentional. It is sloppy and bad as well as intentional. And like it is meant to keep us all wondering and all guessing as we go. That is make it really hard to really know what's going on, like, and to know your enemy, right? It's like one of the things that happened this year was the administration announced that they wanted to remove Checkwell National Monument, and the Washington Post confirmed it. They said the administration has said that their plan is to remove Checkwell National Monument. It was even in a press release about an executive order that said that these monuments had been removed in California, and yet there was no executive order to go with it that actually did that action. And so a lot of those local groups, and I organized with them, hitting the streets and calling your congressperson and waving signs around in downtown Palm Springs and meeting out in the monument and going on Jeep tours of those monuments. And like a lot of organizing around protecting Chuckwalla National Monument, and a lot of people that cared a tremendous amount about that place and about the future of that place, making their voices heard. And the administration never did anything so far, and we're going to keep speaking out about it and keep letting everyone know about how important that place is to the local rural people that live around here that want that place to be whole and want that place to be a tourist attraction and want that place to be conserved and protected. But we don't know what happened there. Yeah. We're dealing with this like mysterious black box with bad intentions. And the black box said it was doing one thing and it actually did a different thing. And then nothing happened for a long time. And now we don't know if it's a fluke or a mistake, or if it's happening next week, or if it's that they're genuinely afraid of the local community turning against them and these districts turning blue instead of being red districts. And it's unknown, and you're shadow boxing at all times.
Yeah. And there's similar processes going on in places like Grand Staircase, Escalante, and Ironwood Forest National Monument near Tucson, Bears Ears, obviously. And it just seems, it's hard to tell whether it's a strategic retreat or just evidence of dementia and short attention span, or maybe Burgum doesn't really want to do it, or maybe he really wants to do it and he's being stopped. It's so hard to tell.
It's hard to know. I will encourage you, and I'm going to try and do this myself and any listeners, to go on the Doug Burgum's National Monuments road trip. There are 6 national monuments in the Pacific or in the Southwest that are under review by the administration. There are 6 in particular they've targeted, and they're all within a relatively short drive of each other. And so you can have a raucous good time going from Chuckwalla to Ironwood to Organ Mountains Desert Peaks in New Mexico to Badish Navajo, Itacuac in Grand Canyon, and Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante. That sounds like a wonderful trip to go on, and just to see some beautiful places this winter and appreciate them and show that those local economies, that they're actually going to benefit a lot from the tourism of protecting those places.
Yeah. I actually just last month, was it last month? It was end of September, had breakfast with some wonderful folks in Las Cruces, and their backyard looks out on the Organ Mountains Desert Peaks National Monument. Just a absolutely spectacular place. And, it's the kind of place you look at and you think, is that the Tetons? It's just really a stunning landscape, and not surprised that it was such a popular designation for Southern New Mexicans.
Yeah, and those are all incredible places. And they also, each of those monuments didn't become what it is without a coalition of tribes saying these are critically important sacred spaces for us, and we need to protect them because of the spiritual history of this land. And that it's not lost on me that that's what they're coming for. Yeah. That's what this administration has targeted.
Wrap-up question. It is 2070, and you're finally deciding to retire. Put your feet up and go fishing or whatever it is you're going to want to do when you're in your 80s. Where do you hope the Joshua Tree is going to be at that point?
All climate scientists, everyone that works on climate change, hopes to be wrong, and hopes that something's wrong in the model that makes it so that the trees persist in space much longer than we think. And maybe those big adult trees are really well adapted to surviving enough drought that they manage to hang on for a long time. I've thought a lot about this question of like, you adopt a sort of quixotic quest for saving a species that might not be savable, or where you might only make a difference around the margins. And like, is it worth expending a whole life, a whole career on saving a species or making it a difference for a species? And I do think that like, if at the end of my career, there's 1,000 more Joshua trees in the world, then I'm okay with having spent all that time. Yeah. Obviously, my ambitions are a little higher than 1,000. I think that our change in fire management policy at Joshua Tree National Park has already saved 1,000 trees at least, and whether those trees are still there in 2070. So I do hope that at the end of my career, there's more trees in the world than there would have been otherwise. Maybe a lot fewer Joshua trees than we have now, but more than there would have been otherwise. I hope our understanding of species and how they adapt to change has, hopefully when it's borne out in reality, that we've learned a lot in the process, that we've got 50 years, 5 decades further along in our understanding of conservation and like how best to protect species. I expect in 2070 we'll be in the middle of a whole bunch of fights over a whole bunch of things, that like the conservation of these landscapes will not be guaranteed, and that we'll still be fighting to protect the places that matter. But that is a fight that should continue for all of time. And I'm okay with that being just a little tiny speck on the spectrum of millions of trees that may or may not live or die. And I hope to make it so that more of them live.
Nick, thank you so much for talking to us. This has been a really interesting conversation. I think the listeners are going to enjoy it. And it's a really important issue, and it's really close to my heart. So
yeah, thank you so much for having me and for listening and continuing this, even when it's hard. I think that we need to see each other fighting for these things, and we need to be visible in order to make a change, in order to convince everyone that is having a hard time, that is not feeling like their science is worth it right now. They need to see that it's worth fighting for, that we can't give up, that this is what our mission is now, is to push back and to make these things that we care about still happen, even when they're under attack.
And that's it for this episode of 90 Miles from Needles, the Desert Protection Podcast. Thanks so much for spending time with us, and huge thanks to Nick Graver for joining me in. It was far too beautiful a day to hide in the studio, so we recorded out on my side porch, hence the slightly different audio texture, and you might hear a trace of a housefly or two in there. As always, gratitude to Joe Jeffrey for his voiceover work, Martine Mancha for our podcast artwork, and Fred Bell for his wonderful nature recordings. Our theme music, Moody Western, comes from Brightside Studio. Additional music in this episode is from I Love Media and Premium Beat, in that order. And thank you to everyone who reached out with kind thoughts about my old pit bull Heart. She's doing much better now that we've found a pain management plan that works, at least for the time being. And it's been a load off. We're about to pack up her and her brother Jack, and both of us humans, and head to a friend's place near Death Valley for a short off-grid recharge. This is one of the reasons that desert protection matters, isn't it? So that all of us can continue to experience these landscapes, their beauty, their intricate ecological relationships, and their absolutely over-the-top occasional wildflower moments. If you value the work we do, as I mentioned before, we'd be grateful for your support. Even a small monthly pledge really helps us keep episodes coming. You can join our supporters at 90milesfromneedles.com/donate. If you can't donate, sharing this episode on social media or leaving a review genuinely helps new listeners find us. As always, please take care of yourselves. Please take care of each other. And together we can defend the desert. Bye now.
"90 Miles from Needles" is a production of the Desert Advocacy Media Network.